So countless texts related to medicine and published in late imperial and republican China have been dismissed or forgotten because of both the quality of their production and the nature of their contents. Contents that were generally non-canonical, unattributed, and considered to be idiosyncratically organized. Such texts were nonetheless repeatedly reprinted, purchased, and used by vast numbers of readers for centuries. The information they imparted was part of the repertoire of what we could think of as vernacular medical knowledge, well into the 20th century. In this talk, I'm particularly concerned with one genre of these widely reprinted and much disdained texts, and these would be the wanbao quanshu. And I will refer to these either as wanbao quanshu or as myriad treasures. That will be the short English term I will use to refer to these texts. So I'm concerned with this genre of texts and also with one persistent kind of knowledge that these texts presented to their readers, and that was embryological knowledge. This knowledge was included in the section on gestation that was generally titled Zhongzi, literally meaning seed. And this was a mainstay in editions of the wanbao quanshu from the inception of the genre in the late Ming through reprints of expanded versions of the Compendia into the 1920s. This continuity is remarkable, especially given the instability of other sections in the wanbao quanshu. Content was repeatedly reduced from the late Ming dynasty to the late Qing. The number of Joan was decreased from 30 to 20. And this included sections on medicine, most of which were omitted in the later, shorter Qing versions. And this was with one exception in the realm of medicine, besides this section on gestation, and that was verified prescriptions. So as this retention of the recipes suggests, these verified prescriptions, the material that was retained in the Compendia over time was more practical, while the material that was omitted was generally more theoretical and conceptual. In this preliminary presentation, I'm really just embarking on this project now. I ask what this repetition of content, specifically on the 10 months of gestation as described in the Zhongzi, can possibly tell us about the way people understood time, process, their world, and their bodies in the late Qing and the early Republic. I structure my analysis according to 4 lines of inquiry that govern an international collaborative project out of which this research emerges. This project is entitled Vernacular Medicine and Modes of Knowing in China, Historical and Global Contexts. It involves partners in Germany, Taiwan, and Canada, together with participants from 5 countries and 4 continents. So in this presentation, I question what this section can tell us more broadly about modes of knowing and local practices in China in this period. And these are 2 key aspects of the Vernacular Medicine Project. I also examine how this understanding can possibly be deepened by exploring global synergies and how it could be facilitated by developments in the digital humanities. So these are 2 other aspects of the project. Undertaking this analysis requires placing the section on gestation in its broader medial and epistemic context. It first requires questioning what the sources for the section on gestation were. As I said at the outset, quite often this material was unattributed, making it difficult for us to trace the sources, but something that is critical for us to do to understand what was going on within this realm of knowledge. These concerns are also at the heart of a working group on common knowledge and its sources in the Sinosphere, 14th to 20th centuries, at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And this working group both overlaps with and in many ways has been a springboard for this project on vernacular medicine. In addition to questioning what the sources for the section on gestation were, I also questioned the extent to which information in the section had traction beyond the pages of the Myriad Treasures itself. As we will see, it traveled into handwritten manuscripts, specifically the medical manuscripts that are housed at the Stabby in the Unschooled collection. And it also traveled even further afield, beyond China's borders, to be included in a didactic text for women in Tokugawa, Japan. The section on gestation combines several different epistemic genres that convey some kind of knowledge. It's divided into two registers in all editions of the text, as we can see from the page that is on the screen. The top register is entitled Effective Methods for Fetal Education. It really doesn't have much to do at all with fetal education, but it describes pregnancy in general. It's concerned with questions of fertility, with auspicious conception, and with methods for predicting or ensuring the birth of either a boy or a girl, generally a boy. The bottom register, which always contains what's considered to be the most important information in the Myriad Treasures, and the section that I will focus on the most, is entitled Illustrated Instructions for the 10 Months of Pregnancy. It offers readers multiple approaches to understanding the signs and symptoms, the possibilities and dangers of conception and childbirth. The different epistemic genres in this section include an image depicting the stage of development of the fetus. Again, you can see these on the pages on the screen. A poetic description of the stage of development, and this is immediately underneath the image. And this poem is then followed by a discursive explanation of the poem. And then following this discursive explanation is, for most months, an herbal recipe that was designed to treat the specific symptoms that might have afflicted the gestating woman in that particular month. This multi-generic text raises a wealth of questions. These include questions about readership or viewership. Were the image and the poem could of course be memorized, were they for the subliterate, perhaps the gestating woman herself and or midwives? Was the explanation of the poem for the inquiring or anxious husband? Was the recipe for the midwife, caregiver, or local healer? These questions take us far beyond the text and into social terrain we can no longer directly penetrate. Before we can attempt to answer them, we can begin by drawing as much as we can from the text itself. I will specifically examine the historical sources for the section and the different narrative modes that it employed. I'll also analyze divergences among the source texts and the Myriad Treasures and consider what these differences may tell us about shifts in audience and in epistemic virtues over time. The description of gestation as a 10-month process and the practice of describing specific physiological changes to the fetus in each of the 10 months dates to well before this period. It actually dates to before the Common Era. It was based on lunar months, which are approximately 28 days each, rather than calendar months, which yielded this 10-month pregnancy model, rather than the 9-month Western model that we are more familiar with. Authors of a number of late-name treatises built on and enriched this long tradition of outlining the 10 months of gestation by adding illustrations that visually depicted the developing fetus. And this was really part of the publishing innovations that are very characteristic of the late Ming, A lot of illustrations came into text at this time, including in the wanbao quanshu and in these earlier treatises that the wanbao quanshu drew on. I've identified two key Ming texts that appear to have been the primary sources for the section. Both of these key source texts have been classified as bedchamber manuals. They are the Zhongzi Shu, written by a certain master of the fragrant apricot creek and published in 1550. They also include a second text which drew itself on the first one, and this is the Shisheng Zhongyao, or Key Points for Preserving Life by Zhongzi, which was published in 1638. A point I want to emphasize here in relation to modes of knowing is that practical knowledge that has been largely overlooked because of its non-canonical status, or that has been considered little more than a curiosity because of its alleged links to erotica, is preserved in the Myriad treasures as a practical, usable form of knowledge. This both provides a new perspective on the so-called bedchamber manuals and gives us a more accurate sense of the scope and content of late imperial knowledge. These non-canonical textual lineages extend back well before the Ming Dynasty, as I noted already. It seems, and I'm still investigating this, that a source for the late Ming treatises for these bedchamber manuals, which were sources for the Myriad treasures, may have been a little understood text, the Qihua Wuzang Lun, or Jivka's treatise on the five viscera, which is no longer extant. The Qihua probably dates to the Tang Dynasty or slightly earlier. Scholars, including the Chinese scholars Chen Ming and Li Qingpu, have debated whether or not it was an Indo-Buddhist text. Donald Harper is adamant that the Qihua was originally Chinese. We know about the existence of this text in part because it was harshly dismissed by the revered medical authority Chen Ziming of the Song Dynasty. Chen described the text in his comprehensive good formulas for women as shallow, lowly, and non-canonical. Charlotte Firth, an authority on women's medicine in the Song, repeated Chen's claim and seems to have had no direct knowledge of the text. This led her to mistranslate Qihua in the title of the text as Venerable Grannies. At the same time, this text, which was dismissed in canonical Chinese medical works, became the foundation of views of gestation in Japan in the early Tokugawa period. The majority of books on the development of the embryo in early Edo were, according to one scholar at least, based on the Qihua Wuzang Lun. The author of the secret book from the Purple Boudoir, who possibly drew from the Qihua himself, there are some similarities in the ways they depict the 10 months, explicitly addressed the question of neglected or undervalued knowledge in his preface. He explained that the register of knowledge that he conveyed in his treatise, this Zhongzi Shu, that this register of knowledge filled in what was missing in more canonical treatises. The purple in his title was an intermediate color without which the full color wheel is not complete. The gui in his title indicated the intercalary month without which the year is not complete. And here there was a bit of slippage between the characters for gui and the actual character for intercalary month, but nonetheless, he made his point. The point was that the knowledge in his text and other texts like it was representative of an in-between epistemic space that authorities such as Chen Ziming may have dismissed, but that many common knowers inhabited. As the figurative language the Purple Boudoir author or compiler suggests, metaphor was a critical narrative mode in conveying information about the various stages of gestation. This was particularly true in the early months before the massive embryonic cells took on some kind of human form. In the purple boudoir and later iterations of the text, the fetus is likened to a dewdrop in the first month, to a blooming flower in the second month, to a silkworm cocoon in the third, and to a fish in the sixth, as it began to float in the amniotic fluid. This metaphorical language melded seamlessly with anatomical language in the description of each month, thus melding medical detail with poetic material. The narrative that is repeated in the Myriad Treasures tracked the fetus's physical journey. In the first month, it was not yet settled in the uterus, but was in the euphemistically described trouser gate, or the vagina. In the second month, the fetus is situated in the North Pole, which the commentary explains is the pubic area precisely 6th below the vulva. In the fourth month, the fetus enters the utero, into which it is securely ensconced by the fifth month. The narrative describes the substance of the fetal blob in the third month in physiological terms, likening it to congealed blood. It also tracks fetal movement, first mentioning quickening in the sixth month. Most importantly, the narrative traces embryonic development, both mirroring and elaborating on what appears in the images that accompany the poem and the explanations. It describes the growth of hair in the sixth month in the Myriad Treasures, but in the eighth month in the Purple Boudoir and the Key Points for Preserving Life. It records sexual differentiation detectable in the fifth month, in part by the mother's cravings for particular foods, in part by the direction that the fetus could be felt to move in utero, or by the side to which the birth mother would turn when called from behind. The narrative also tracks the development of the sensory organs and the orifices, seventh month in the Myriad Treasures, ninth in the Purple Boudoir and the Key Points. 8th month, the fetus is deemed complete. In the 9th, it becomes very heavy. In the 10th, it is ready to be born. As is evident in the variations in timing of the growth of hair or the development of sensory organs that I just noted, saying that there were differences between the Myriad Treasures and the text that it drew on, compilers of the Myriad Treasures did not mechanically duplicate material from their source texts, nor did the source texts mechanically copy one another. In addition to divergences concerning the month in which certain physical features appeared, there were also divergences in appeals to expertise and in the concreteness of the knowledge conveyed. The compiler of the Purple Boudoir invoked several different authorities, most of whom I have not been able to identify. Whereas Zhongzi, who was the compiler of the Key Points, who drew often directly from the Purple Boudoir, he did not invoke any authorities. He dropped the names of these different experts that the compiler of the Purple Boudoir drew on. They included a certain Liu Mei, a certain Jiang Xuanzhuang, and a Mr. Cui. The Myriad Treasures compilers invoked the same cast of authorities as the compiler of the Purple Boudoir, often even more liberally. So there were instances where the Myriad Treasures would attribute a particular passage to one of these authorities when it hadn't been invoked in the Purple Boudoir. In one instance, the Purple Boudoir compiler quoted an identifiable historical figure, also on the slide, a certain Lu Bo. He quoted Lu's statement in the Canon of Difficult Issues, the Nanjing, that a fetus born in the seventh month could be viable. The Myriad Treasures also repeated this reference, but often the character ended up being miswritten. So instead of Lu, the character was Tai. Another difference between the Myriad Treasures and its source text is in register. The Compendia were slightly more secular, clinical, and concrete than the source texts. This is evident in some linguistic adjustments, but also in certain shifts in the description of physical processes. While the language in the Myriad treasures is generally as metaphorical as in the source text, there are places where it is more concrete. For example, the purple boudoir and the key points both liken the amorphous, dispersed, or concentrated mass that is the fetus to duckweed floating on water in the first month. An interesting image, duckweed floating on water. The Myriad treasures text merely likens the fetal mass to menstrual blood. At the time of parturition, the compilers of the Myriad treasures were more anatomically specific in describing the readiness of the gestating body to give birth. They referred to limbs, shoulders, and the spine opening or loosening, whereas compilers of the purple boudoir and the key points used more conceptual abstract language, describing the opening of cracks and with references to vital essences. As noted at the outset, it is extremely difficult to get a sense of who read these passages on primed gestating bodies and floating duckweed. There are, however, and it is also difficult to in any way determine how, where, and among whom the Myriad treasures would have circulated. Here, reading the medical manuscripts can be of some help. Without systematically examining all the over 800 texts in the Unshoaled collection, I've come across two manuscripts that reprised material either directly from the section on gestation in the Myriad treasures or directly from the key points. That practitioners in the early 20th century would have considered this material important and authoritative enough to hand copy into their own manuscripts provides insights into the ongoing relevance of this material on pregnancy to later audiences. The first manuscript, identified as number 8444 in the Unshoaled archive in the Stabi Library collection, is from a Mr. Xiang's Bamboo Clyde Pavilion collection. This is the name of the manuscript. That's the author of the manuscript, sorry. The manuscript itself is entitled Nu Ju Zhang, All Pathoconditions in Gynecology. It is a collection of gynecological treatises of a similar register to the information on pregnancy in the Myriad treasures. And interestingly, Professor Unshoaled, who did such an incredible job of identifying the texts that were written into the manuscripts, had to say that he threw up his hands and had no sense what the source was for these two last sections in this new cook. And now we have a sense of what the sources were. It seems that this text, as Professor Unshoaled determined, was copied in the late Qing dynasty. The final two sections are almost precise copies of material in the section on gestation in the Myriad treasures. Because the manuscript is single registered, the material in the upper and lower registers in the Compendia appears sequentially. First, the section on fetal education, and then the section on 10 months. The compiler even hand copied the illustrations of each stage of the development of the fetus, and again copied them very similarly to what appeared in the Myriad treasures. There are several indications that our author, Mr. Xiang, used the Myriad treasures and not one of the earlier texts as his source. He closely followed the precise order of the 30-some subsections and entries in the gestation section. When the Myriad treasures editors deviated from the purple boudoir, Mr. Xiang deviated in precisely the same way. He also used the same terminology as the Zhongzi men when it differed slightly from source texts. At the same time, Mr. Xiang revealed that he was a knowledgeable thinking practitioner and not just a mechanical copyist. There are a number of instances where he improves on the Myriad treasures text. he corrected mistaken calculations for determining the sex of the fetus in 2 instances. And this suggests that these texts were valued despite the errors that they were actually quite riven. Because his text is hand copied rather than printed, he was able to accurately represent the trigrams when they are referenced in determining the sex of the fetus. So the Compendia had merely printed a series of undistinguishable lines. I guess it was difficult to represent the trigrams, the broken lines, using lithographic technology. So hopefully you can see in the text on the right, it just looks like the character san has been repeated over and over. Whereas on the handwritten manuscript, we can see clearly the distinction between the broken lines and the solid lines. The unidentified compiler of the second manuscript, and this is manuscript number 8175, gave this text the rather lofty title of Yizhong Fu, or Lineage of Gynecology. Again, the copyist seems to be relatively learned. His handwriting is careful, but he did often simplify characters, as he did in the title you can see here, and he did occasionally miswrite them. The source for this manuscript is clearly not the Myriad treasures, but key points for preserving life. The description of anatomical development in each month follows the key points rather than the Myriad treasures, and it includes recipes that are featured in the key points but not included in the Myriad treasures. And it omits, as Zhongzi, the compiler of the key points, did, the names of medical authorities that were invoked in the Purple Boudoir and repeated in the Myriad treasures. So those names I had on the screen earlier, Liu Mei and a Mr. Zheng and a Mr. Cui. The second manuscript nonetheless underscores the point that this kind of knowledge, multi-generic, poetically evocative, suggestively illustrated, medically useful, continued to have an audience in the early Republic. Sum up what I've tried to demonstrate so far: a similar rendition of the 10 months of gestation, the poems, and in later texts, the images and the poems, thus circulated from ancient times to an influential but non-extant pre-Tang text, to late Ming bedchamber manuals, to late Ming illustrated Myriad treasures, to Qing and Republican editions of Myriad treasures, to hand-copied manuscripts. It even continued to be reprinted in Republican New Style daily use compendia that were not in the Myriad treasures lineage, and that's a point I'll return to in the conclusion. This particular brand of knowledge of gestation also circulated outside of China. A key example is an 1847 revised version of a lifestyle guide for women that had first been published in Tokugawa, Japan in 1692, the Onochoho Key, or the Record of Women's Great Treasures. Takai Ranzan, the compiler of the 1847 version of this text, had the illustrations that appeared in the original edition completely redone by Katsushika Oi, the daughter of the renowned Katsushika Hokusai, the very well-known ukiyo-e painter. Most importantly for our purposes, in his discussion of gestation and elsewhere in his text, he announced a clear epistemological break from Buddhism, which had structured the understanding of embryology in the original 1692 version of this woman's text. This earlier version had been rooted in descriptions of fetal Buddhahood, derived from such texts as the 1649 Unity of the Three Wisdoms, the Sanken Ichisho, an important syncretic Buddhist writing. The 1692 version envisioned the womb as a passageway from the divine to the human. It represented the first to the fourth months as various ritual paraphernalia, and hopefully you can see on the screen the first 4 boxes, sort of in the middle register on the right, are Buddhist ritual elements, and they stand in for the first 4 months of gestation of the fetus. It named specific Buddhist deities who looked over the fetus in the following months. So Jizo in the 5th, Miroku in the 6th, Yakushi in the 7th, Kannon in the 8th, Seishi in the 9th, and Amida Nyorai in the 10th month. Takai rejected this cosmology. He inserted into the text a strong caution against notions of wombs that were cluttered with ritual instruments, of the human form developing from sacramental objects, of physical bodies receiving Buddhas. He recommended that his readers put away the view of Buddhas in the womb and that they understand their bodies solely from the perspective of contemporary medical writings. And what does he turn to as a contemporary medical writing? Material from the Myriad treasures, based, as we have seen, on prior bedchamber manuals, which were themselves possibly based on a text dismissed by one of the great authorities on Chinese women's medicine. So this text, the wanbao quanshu, often dismissed, often belittled, is given a medical imprimatur by Takai Ranzan in the mid-19th century. Takai had Oi, the illustrator that he hired, he had her add to his updated version of the Record of Women's Great Treasures a new set of womb illustrations taken from the Myriad treasures as a way of countering the Buddhist version of gestation in the original text. He did not explicitly cite the wanbao quanshu, but he did state that the theory of gestation that he propounded came from a Chinese daily use book, or an Eryong Shu. A cursory reading of Takai's text reveals that his source was indeed the Myriad treasures. Two of the developmental differences in the Compendia versus the earlier source texts are repeated in Takai's work. So he claims that hair will grow in the 6th month rather than the 8th, that the sensory organs develop in the 7th month rather than the 9th. And there are other small repetitions as well. Whereas the source text claim the birth mother is carrying a girl if she craves food that is bland, Takai follows the Myriad treasures in claiming she would crave food that was sweet. So what can such global synergies tell us? Concerning the receiver of knowledge, in this case Tokugawa Japan, it reveals the importance of local historical conditions of possibility in driving external borrowing. Takai lived in a moment when middle-level intellectuals like himself were increasingly critical of the Buddhist approach to life and the body. They assailed it as foreign and irrational. At the same time, Takai did not hesitate to use the foreign material from the wanbao quanshu because he deemed it rational, medical, and scientific, and thus in the service of his own cultural and political ends. The fourth aspect of our project on vernacular medicine, digital humanities, I will say little about at this point because it is still in the process of developing, and it is not an aspect of the project that I am particularly expert in. But I want to note that developments are underway at the Max Planck Institute, really in the context of the Common Knowledge in the Sinosphere project, and that is really going to assist us in this vernacular medicine project, and also at Academia Sinica, where work is being done on another set of materials. But I do hope that this paper has underscored how important digital tools will be in helping with what is really painstaking work of tracing both illustrations and sections of text among daily use materials, across these materials and their possible source texts, and hopefully ultimately between Chinese and foreign editions. To conclude, I want to briefly return to the question of epistemic register in the Myriad Treasures section on gestation. Understandings of natural history, of medicine, and of science shifted significantly in the over 300 years when the Myriad Treasures were in print. As we saw in Takai Ranzan's evaluation of the section on gestation in the Compendia, it presented to outside authorities as a relatively secular and medical depiction of pregnancy as late as the mid-1840s. It illustrated and described anatomy, however schematically, and it visualized the fetus as a physiological entity, not as a religious ideal, as in the kind of Buddhist devotional literature to which Takai was so opposed. Takai's perception of the text urges us to examine the extent to which the depiction of gestation in the Myriad treasures represented a similar epistemic break in China. In different genres of texts at different moments in the past, in China as well, the fetus had stood in for particular philosophical ideas and religious ideals. In Orthodox cosmogenesis, in natal astrology, and in Taoist philosophy, for example. When and where did the Myriad Treasures version of the 10 months present as an epistemic challenge to these other ideas, or did it? And if the secular and the medical were key features of the section on gestation, how did the Myriad Treasures narrative fare when increasingly secularized and medicalized representations of childbirth became available just a decade after Takai featured this version of the 10 months in his record of women's great treasures? In 1858, the British missionary Benjamin Hobson was the first to present a Chinese readership with such a detailed, medicalized representation in his treatise on midwifery and diseases of children, the Fuixin Shuo. While Hobson's text would have had limited circulation among common readers when it first appeared, by the early 20th century, several compilers of daily use texts, which targeted an audience that would have been similar to audiences of the Myriad Treasures over previous centuries, followed Hobson's lead. They included the compiler of a very curious almanac-like collection that featured talismans and the recommendations, as we can see here, of the Taoist heavenly master Zhong to ward off demonic causes of illnesses. So we have on the one side of this page, a talisman and this talismanic figure. And on the other side, we have this anatomical image from Hobson's treatise, which is a description in Hobson's case, at least, of the umbilical cord. It's given a different caption in the later Chinese text, but nonetheless, the image is clearly one that drew on Hobson. Other compilers also drew on Hobson and various other newly circulating medical texts for their illustrations of the succession of phases of fetal development, from reptile-like being to recognizable infant. Despite the entrance of such texts into the commercial marketplace of illustrations and ideas in the early 20th century, and despite the gradual biomedicalization of discourse in this period, some compilers continued to reprint the visual, versified, and useful approach to gestation first printed in the Myriad Treasures centuries earlier. And here I have an example from 1928. We could attribute this to editorial expediency. It was easier to reprint widely available material, but as we've already seen, other kinds of widely available material would have been available to editors at this time. Also, the woodblock or lithograph Myriad Treasures text would have to have been, and it did have to be, in this case, reformatted for letterpress editions. It could not merely be mechanically reprinted. I would argue that rather than merely editorial expediency, the persistence of this time-worn section on gestation reveals the persistence of certain modes of knowing, specifically modes of knowing that emphasized a particular understanding of time and process. Rather than depict fetal development as a purely physiological progression that could be fast-forwarded and outlined on a page or two, Compilers of the text discussed in this presentation, from the secret purple boudoir to key points for preserving life, from the myriad treasures to the manuscripts held in the Unshelled collection, compilers of these various texts chose to let the process of fetal development unfold gradually, from dewdrop-like embryo to four-limbed fetus to increasingly sentient, ripe to be born, unborn child. A simply illustrated text that melded the metaphorical with the anatomical, the practical with the suggestive, aligned with their readers' understanding and experience of the 10 months of gestation, more directly than more clinical descriptions and more scientific illustrations. While these scientific materials offered invaluable insights, they could not fully capture what invariably remained the slow, often terrifying, and always mysterious passage from conception to gestation to the miracle of childbirth.